welcome to another edition of the Rant Forum. I am your host, Liquid Jubina. As always, we welcome your questions, concerns, and suggestions for the show at therantforum@gmail.com. Something important on All Hallows Eve and Halloween, what the show that we are recording essentially tonight, is one of the topics that came up today, earlier in the day, is dealing with issues, problems in your life, and how people deal with them differently. Quick story, backstory, as I always like to give a personal point of reference to everything that essentially the message that I want to convey is last year when I was in Poland, I have an uncle. He was the youngest in my mother's family, from the mother's side. When he was 16 or 17, he fell into a pond and started drowning, and afterwards developed schizophrenia. And this same uncle, throughout my time of knowing him, went through a lot of different transitions. He gained weight, lost weight, sometimes would lose hair, depending on what medications he was on and what was going on in his life. Sometimes you'd see him and he'd look like a different person after 2 or 3 years. So he changed greatly. He changed more than anybody else in our lives did that we knew. And a huge reason because of that was the medications he was taking. But the last time that I was in Poland, in my home country, and visiting with my mom, I remember him actually stopping us and saying to us that we'd go outside for a cigarette or whatever, and he'd say, this is probably the last time that I'm going to see your mom. And my mom travels to Poland once every 5 to 10 years. I try to go every year or so. And he said, you know what, it's going to be probably the last time I see you also. And I said, what are you talking about? I go, you're going to be here next year. He was always in the woods. He was a bit of a woodsman. So he lived in a village where they were out in the woods, and we would see them, and we'd go out there, and he knew every single tree that grew in that forest around his house. He swam in the pond that was nearby by himself most of the time. He just know those woods in and out, the way that hunters know the area that they keep going back to every year in Michigan or Minnesota. But how I dealt with that, 3 months after coming back to the United States, he died. He passed away. And I remember speaking to my mom afterwards, and I was telling her, I said, I said, he knew about this whole thing. I'd like to be able to remember him. I asked my family for photos from the funeral, which is a very, very common thing in both European and American cultures from a long time ago, when people could not make the funeral service. What they asked for were photos, and that kept them connected to the person who was deceased. And to my mom, I remember her response, and it's not that she is passive about things, but she looked back and she said, you know what, she goes, to me, I don't have to deal with it until I go to Poland again. She said, to me, he's still walking in those woods every day. He's still picking up mushrooms. He's still looking at trees. He's still swimming. He's still eating. He's still alive, and he's just walking around there. And the spirit of the person very well may be. But it's an important thing of what I want to talk about in the sense of rehabilitation with things that have happened that are traumatic in our lives today. And part of the reason I want to talk about it and why this topic was chosen today is because I was sitting outside of a bar today on Halloween, looking outside of this backwards patio, and I saw a 3-car accident. And a truck had actually driven in between 2 cars, rear-ended the first one, pushed it off to the side of the road, fishtailed off, hit another one, stopped because it hit the red lights, you could see it clearly, and then kept on going afterwards. The driver either had something to hide or was drunk, or who knows what it was. But it made me notice and recognize in life just how precious life is. Because as a first responder to the accident, to my dismay, it was an individual that I just spoken to in the bar 15 minutes prior before he left. And it was about the Notre Dame game that he was watching on TV at the time. And he had a jersey on. So you see a guy in a bar, you have a beer next to him, you're sitting there talking, you're just making small talk, and 15 minutes later he's having a difficult time catching his breath on the side of the road after a rear-end collision and going off the road. And luckily there were no bystanders, so he actually went off and hit a fence, so the front of his car was damaged as well. And I don't know how many beers he had. I don't know if he was, driving while under the influence or just driving after a few drinks. I don't know the whole status of the whole thing. What I do know is, had I not talked to him, would he have left 15 seconds or 5 minutes earlier, or would he have found somebody else and talked to them for another 5 or 10 minutes? Would that have kept him out of harm's way? Those are the great unknowns of life. But being a veteran, being a person that goes through life, every single one of us has things that we do not want to admit to. It may be our own failures. Some of them, it may be things that we can't do. For example, our girlfriend asks us to wash the dishes, and we can't do it in her time frame, because in our time frame it might be 2 or 3 days. In hers, it's, I asked you to do them, why don't you do them now? Even though we perhaps ourselves would never demand of her to do something that we ask of her in the very same instance, in the very same time frame. Another person in my life, very close to me, whose mother is from Colombia, told me that her mother could never travel back to Colombia, in the same way that my mom has a hard time going back to Poland now. My mom going back to Poland would involve her immersing herself in the fact that my uncle has passed away and is gone. This woman, her mother, because the country of Colombia does not recognize divorce, would still be considered married to a husband that was abusive towards her and perhaps towards the family, and that's why she cannot go back there. But it brings a greater part of responsibility in our lives. And what I want to talk about is the individual responsibility you have to yourself. We have plenty of people now who take out far too many college loans, school loans, home loans, things that they cannot afford, that the bank clearly knows they can't afford beforehand, and that's one part of the problem, but also they know they can't afford it going into the deal. And this is the same scumbagged methodology that's used when you go and you want to buy a car, because the car dealer will often ask you, well, what do you want your monthly payments to be? And you'll say $250, and they'll say up to. Well, when you give them your immediate payment, you say the highest amount you want to pay, which is $250. And then they say up to, and then they lowball you. And immediately you want to please them, so you say $300. You think in your mind, 2-3 less lunches out eating sushi, I can make that for a month. I'll go out one less time a week eating sushi, for example. And every time I go out there, it costs an extra $20. So you go from $250 to $340 or $330. And then lo and behold, you may not be able to make those payments, and you get behind on those payments. A very close friend of mine from high school had a father who battled alcoholism for the better part of 20 years to his ending days. And they ran a successful business. But one day, this gentleman, her father, went out to a liquor store, bought a pint or a fifth of whiskey, drank it in the car. It was 85, 90 degrees out that day, even hotter in a car with the windows rolled up. And he basically drank to the point of being incoherent and unconscious, and sat in the car for 4 to 5 hours, passed out until he dehydrated and essentially expired. And at the funeral, what struck me about this person and the funeral and what had happened was that this woman that I knew very well from high school said to her grandmother at the funeral, she said, she goes, alcoholism, I look at it now as being a terrible disease. And it's so awful that it afflicted him. And the grandmother, who was born during the 30s or 40s, looked at her and said, oh, honey, we don't know that. We don't know that. Even though the medical examiner had looked at his liver and said it was bright yellow, so even if he had completely stopped drinking and went on a vegan diet and juiced all the time and lived as healthily as you could possibly imagine, the liver would have given out. Now, the reason I bring that up is because there are many war veterans. There are those who have definitely seen some shit and been through some shit and don't want to talk about anything. And there's other ones that haven't seen that much and talk about a lot of things. There's the World War II group, and out of them, I was fortunate enough while I was stationed in South Korea to meet with the real Shifty Powers from the Band of Brothers and the actor that portrayed him. and be able to speak with him. And he said, none of us, he said, absolutely none of us, we went back home after World War II. Absolutely none of us wanted to talk about anything that we had been through. We wanted to go on with our daily lives. Some of us got a job as a machinist. Other ones worked at, a restaurant. Somebody did plumbing. He said, and after 30 or 40 years of that, somebody came to us and wanted to write a book on Easy Company. And he said it was one of the best, most rehabilitative things that we could have done is opened up and talked about it. And then, of course, Steven Spielberg put it into pictures so we could watch it and enjoy it, because the majority of us perhaps would not read a book on that topic or that story. So he made it digestible for the masses. Well, in World War II, the people that came back were considered heroes, and oftentimes they landed in major ports like New York City or San Francisco, I think maybe from Los Angeles, and they were regarded as heroes, and there were large parades for them when they came back to the United States as being heroes and having won the war. Because of media and the importance of telling a story, whether it's truthful or not, and the sensation behind it coming out, the veterans that were coming back, the people that had fought during Vietnam, did not receive that same courtesy. And they were already considered baby killers before they came back, because of perhaps one person that might have shot a kid over there, or somebody that had taken a photo of somebody abusing one of the people, the Vietnamese that they were fighting with. And it didn't always tell you the backstory. So the older generation, the way that they dealt with things was not talking about them. It's poisoned the new generation, because the middle generation to the new generation has dealt with much trauma. And there have been people that have been 40 years old, 45 years old, that have drank themselves to death because they perhaps were molested or sexually abused by a gym teacher at school, a football coach at school, somebody from the Cub Scouts, somebody from the Catholic Church, which I personally know of a few situations that I've even witnessed in my life. But the point was to not talk about it. And if you didn't talk about it, it didn't exist. Well, that makes as much sense today as it did back then, and as it does with, for example, if you owe back taxes to the IRS, or the police are coming after you, or your wife has filed for divorce, and you sit there thinking to yourself that as long as I don't say anything about it, I'm not guilty of it, they can't charge me with that, I don't have to fess up to what I've done or not done, and that's a long line and a crock of bullshit. It is. It is one of the hardest things, and Aristotle even spoke about this, the hardest mastery is the mastery of the self, of mastering yourself. Being able to look at yourself and saying, here's where I am weak, here are my strong points. It is extremely important to know what your strong points are in life, because you can learn with those, you can move forward with those. Those are things that help you out. But it's even more actually important to know what are your weak points. A weak point of mine perhaps may be creating websites. Well, a weaker point to me would be to go back and learn from start to finish how to create good websites, fully functional ones. It's cheaper for me and it's more cost effective for me to find somebody who has meddled in that over the last 5 to 10 years, who stayed up with the progress of the industry to be able to do that. It's not to say I can't learn if I'm there in a meeting with a person or talking to them, but that is the more sensible route to take. So what should you do in life? Should you go through life and think to yourself, you know what? Yeah, bad things have happened to me. I don't want to talk about them. I'll keep them closed. Talking about them is a weakness. The most important thing I could do, and the best thing I could do for myself is to be quiet about them. That's actually the easy way out. The easy way out, even though it may terrify more of us more often and give us nightmares and bad dreams more often and keep us awake late at night more often, the easy thing to do is to take the easy way out and not talk about those. And the best time, and this is an old place saying where you meet a friend in life, is when you have nothing to offer that friend. So when you're able to open up and people around you actually listen to what you're saying, whether they respond in a way that is conducive to healing to you or not, is irrelevant. What's more relevant and what's more important is the fact that they're able to listen at times, is the fact that they're able to shut off whatever bullshit they may want to spew at that moment and just be able to listen. And that's the healing aspect of things. And it doesn't take a counselor to be able to do that. And it certainly should not take a generational gap of people telling us that it's wrong to open up about things. The things that I open up on, the things that I'm personal with, and of course you may challenge me to this as a viewer, are things that are personal to me and things that I've lived through. It's not because I've read an article on Rush Limbaugh or Donald Trump and I agree with one part or don't agree with the other and this is what I want to talk about. They're personal things that I've had to deal with. And I'm open and vulnerable to that. I don't think you can be any more vulnerable than a 20-minute camera looking you straight in the face and pretending you're talking to another individual, even though I may be talking to thousands. That is the most open that anybody possibly could be. And are there mistakes? Are there things that sometimes I may say that I wish perhaps I couldn't say or were more articulate as saying? Of course. But such is life. I fess up to it. I look it straight in the face. I'll talk about it. I'll be open about it. To all of us, we have a responsibility, first and foremost to ourselves, to be able to be open, to be honest with ourselves, to be able to talk to people that are our significant others in life, are our friends, are people we hang out with, are people we spend time with. That's first and foremost. Their responsibility to us is to do no more than listen. And they don't have to agree with us. They don't have to disagree with us. It's about listening. But our first and foremost responsibility lies in being able to open up and talk about things that others perhaps will not talk about. That's an important element. And if we lose that, or if we give up on that, that will eat us alive, the same way that it's eaten many World War II veterans alive, the same way that it continues to eat many Vietnam veterans and Iraq War veterans alive today. People who have come home and over 30 years have suffered with PTSD have not been able to get help because in their mind, under the parenting and the guise of their parents that they grew up under, it was a weakness to talk about the very things that bother you and that are difficult for you to deal with. And that's my final thought. Our first and foremost responsibility lies within ourselves. Everyone else's, they can take it as they may, but it may be one of the best opportunities for you to be able to look at who truly is your friend in life, who listens, who doesn't want to correct you necessarily, who wants to process with you, but more importantly than anything else, who will listen to what you've been through, because all of us have been through challenges. As always, I welcome any comments for the Rant Forum. You can write it on the rantforum at gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for paying attention, and have a wonderful night.